Good afternoon. It's 3 minutes before 5 o'clock on August 12th, 2021. I've already stated and have already made it formal, even with the Internal Revenue Service, that I believe that if you received individual relief in terms of the payouts connected to COVID 19, that it is actually a form of income and it should be reflected and recorded as such. Some people in this country, including myself, have not been in a position where we have been able to acquire employment during this time frame. Then this is through no fault of our own. As a matter of fact, I personally have made several good faith efforts to acquire employment, and unfortunately, the terms of employment during this time frame have not been accurately reflected. There has been a variety of other sorts of financial processes that have been ongoing that have not been disclosed to the people. And I contend that that is actually being done in a very illegal manner, not just by American law and by the precepts of the Constitution of the United States, and not just in accordance with things we were already warned about, not only leading up to the 2008 banking bailout, but during the 2008 banking bailout, including in cases that went before the court, including in decisions that were decided by federal regulatory agencies, and including in congressional hearings that were had at the time. And that what's happened is there is an attempt to, if nothing else, exploit the situation around COVID 19 to allow people that got away with it before to get away with it again. It's a very large scale form of criminal double leverage that they're trying to work on us. And in the course of that, one of the major things they're doing is engaging in misrepresentation of people's capacity to provide for themselves and or manage their own resources effectively and efficiently. And as part of what I contend could potentially be revealed with the COVID 19 relief. Now, the understanding that the government would just give you free money without any strings attached has already been proven, if nothing else, over the last 15 years to not be 100% accurate. Now, I knew and have made public ever since the beginning of the declaration regarding COVID 19 and the alleged stimulus, which it has been called at times, or relief, as it has been called at times, that there were significant debates going on in Congress about what it was about and what it should entail. Let me remind you of something very important that happened, which is that the first COVID relief was approved and put into a situation of being distributed to people around April 15th of 2020. This would have been tax day for individual filers in the United States. And there was significant contestation because on that day, President Donald Trump sent a personal letter to people who were recipients of COVID 19 relief. I have one of them. Even though I got an electronic deposit, and it was also, by the way, in the course of me already having contested a prior tax return effort with the IRS, which left my own understanding of whether it was relief or whether it was actually a tax return based upon an appeal on a previous tax record. Despite that fact, I did get the letter from the President of the United States, and there was controversy at the time when specifically congressional Democrats were very upset, and they were admonishing the President for sending this letter at that time. Well, April 15th, also through the standard congressional budgeting process, is also the day that the President is given a deadline to send to Congress the first of what he intends to be his budgetary priorities for the year. And so during 2020, that time frame when the office of the White House should have been putting together budgetary priorities that were to be deliberated on and determined by and through the congressional budget process throughout the year 2020, ended up getting usurped and inverted by the actions that Congress took under the alleged auspices of COVID 19 relief. Please understand and remember, this was also during an alleged impeachment effort and also during a time frame wherein there was contestation by both the president and the vice president, who, by the way, has a very specific role, especially after actions taken by former President Barack Obama concerning the specific role the president of the Senate plays when it comes to responding to a health pandemic. And both of them were in a situation where they were contesting what they understood to be the appropriate implementation of policy regarding the response to COVID 19, while Congress had taken action to assure that those relief payments were being distributed to Americans right in time for tax day. Now, I filed my taxes this year and I reflected COVID relief as being a form of income that I used for my LLC. I have all the receipts. I have all of the actual tangible items, as well as all of the records I need to prove. That's exactly what I did with it. And to be honest with you, I had personally spent several years without having any kind of meaningful income at all, including through gainful employment, while I was trying to go through a court process that required me to sign an affidavit to agree to be a pauper or proceed in the form of a pauper. And so at this time, while this pandemic was happening, this money was distributed to people throughout the United States based specifically upon reported income and understandings of how they calibrated or factored into an understanding of their situation based upon their reported income. It was income, one way or another. And I contend that if we were to be in a position where we understood it as income, then we would be in a situation where we would have actual leverage to remove any sort of justification that we were nothing more than somebody else's proxy. That other people that have, for some reason, in some manner, been able to consolidate financial resources or acquire some other kind of credit that allows for them to be identified as market makers or market movers, or people that are the ones that are trying to get the economy back and moving, that's actually not accurate. That relief was actually distributed to the American people while other processes were ongoing, while we were actually creating very significant kinds of value that could have also been identified as income, and income that had been generated by our actions. And insofar as some of us, like myself, actually had a small business or started a small business during that time, then the relationships the government had to using business efforts as part of a health pandemic as opposed to, say, war, have a different and very specific manner in which the government is required to uphold its duties, whether it is operating within its ministerial powers or even its police powers, or as a market participant in dealing with people who are incorporated and have their own business, as well as individuals that are participating in a financial relationship with the government, including during a time of emergency. I contend your relief was actually income. Do not be upset about having it reflected as income. Based upon current tax law they did not change in time for this tax season. Based upon those laws, depending upon what you had available to you in terms of the legal remedies that business owners had, for instance, or individuals had when it came to consideration of tax credits and or some sort of other understanding of how to apply and consider income in connection with, for instance, fixed assets or investments, then you may have been actually entitled to a refund. You may have been entitled to a refund based upon registering that COVID relief as income. Does that sound kind of counterintuitive? No, it doesn't, because that's exactly what they've done with the entire economy on a huge scale. And the question is, well, who was allowed to be availed of that kind of a situation? This is exactly the kind of matters that were being discussed during the 2008 banking bailout. Except at that time, it was these larger banks and these larger financial services firms that were talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, some of which is still registered as a subsidy on ledger sheets to this time frame. Now, would you accept that as a subsidy that was allowed to be attributed as some form of debt that then ultimately is going to fall on us as the people, at least under their pretenses, to participate in a manner of speaking or a manner of actually dealing with it as debt? Or would you be the kind of person that would understand it as something that was provided to you so that you could make your own decisions about what you understood to be a way to protect yourself and your family and your community during a pandemic, and or prepare yourself and your family and your community during a pandemic with an understanding that you would necessarily have to pay taxes? And in the course of paying taxes, you may be availed of some form of tax return. And if somebody's disappointed with the manner in which that tax return is accorded, then it is necessary for us to revise our tax policy. See, I personally, based upon that understanding, would have been eligible for a tax return that would have been the entire amount of that first relief. But I would have put it in a U.S. savings bond. And so when we're in this situation where now we're trying to talk about how to address the economy, including our state economies that have been impacted, including our local economies that have been impacted, and also including, for instance, understanding that we might live in a locality that had to take out or did agree to take out some form of local municipal bond, including during a time frame where they had to include in the introduction to their bond issue that because of COVID-19, there were going to be certain unknowns that may impact the capacity to fulfill obligations as they were originally proposed. You know, if you understand that there was any effort at good faith in those regards, then this would have to take into account a full spectrum of analysis. Even if every single person that received that first, for instance, $1,200 assistance, or if you were a married couple and allowed it to be characterized as such, $2,400. And even the second or the third, even if every single one of them reported it as income and ended up receiving a tax return off of that, we would be in a very different situation when it came to assessing what do we have to work with and who are we working with, especially if you recorded it as income and then in the course of attempting to apply for some sort of tax refund, you then had to list your business expenses. And then those business expenses could be identified as some sort of collateral inventory, including one that might have unique relationships that should not be exclusively allowed to be acquired and misused by the government in abuse of its state police powers, which I contend is what they're doing. See, the trade-off for the relief, without having to worry about it, was that they were going to surveil what you did with it and allow for that financial information to be made available to other people besides you and your community. I'm not going to allow that to occur. By now, I could have used that as part of an investment to actually fulfill certain things that were already outstanding before the pandemic. But I was put on hold in the lead up to the pandemic in ways that make any sort of intent to try to define any good faith effort to respond to it as a pandemic seem very suspect, and only as if it was nothing more than a perpetuation of the persistent crime I had been trying to challenge beforehand. This is a very, very essential, very immediate, very practical matter each of us could take stake in. I would say, and I would recommend, please, in consideration of this, do consider that when you evaluate it as income, that any tax return would then be made available for a bond that then could be used in whatever you would be dealing with moving forward. How you use your bonds could be a completely different paradigm around us actually educating ourselves and each other and investing in our communities, including in ways that allow us and our communities to have ownership of things in our communities as opposed to having it force consolidated so it can be parcelized and then sold off to foreign interests that have no accountability to us. It is completely unacceptable that our government is doing that right now, that our government had the intent to do that. They're not our government. And that's the whole understanding if we allow for people to represent themselves as being our government while they do that. So I'm encouraging everybody to reconsider and recomport themselves and understand August 15th is a very important timeline when it comes to the congressional budget process. That timeline is ours. And I contend that what they're doing and whatever these alleged infrastructure debts or bills that they're putting on and this consternation over the debt ceiling is incredibly disingenuous. This should be our time. This should have been our time to actually show that regardless of whatever the subterfuge is, we had the capacity to actually provide a meaningful contribution to whatever would be the legacy moving forward. And I, for one, am not going to allow them to say that they gave me charity and then they get to claim everything else about my life I've done in the meantime to use for very nefarious purposes, especially when they've refused to deal with the crime we need to deal with. In this situation, those matters related to crime have to be addressed. But what we also need to address is who we are and where we are and what our value is. And I contend we're very valuable. If nothing else, I can tell you right now what was proven was that I gave back at least as much as I was given, maybe more. How many of the rest of us are in that same situation? And so these discussions about debt ceiling and these discussions about debt and trillions of dollars, including and especially in regards to infrastructure, would have a very, very different consideration right now. There might be an actual basis for understanding this as a real investment in our country, as opposed to somebody else's business plan that they attempt to try to manipulate us into participating in without our informed consent. Again, have a good day.